Good morning, everyone. Today I'm continuing my series, the Layman's Guide to Headstones series, by first today presenting you with the following example of the headstone we'll be talking about quite a lot today, and that is the humble yet quite magnificent obelisk. Now, the example you see in front of you right here is not necessarily a headstone, but it is a monument, a memorial that is dedicated to the 16,000 men that are buried here at Oakwood Cemetery's Confederate section, many of whom are unknown, but many of them are known, but they don't have markers. So, in 1866, the Oakwood Memorial Foundation, the Ladies Memorial Society, to be more specific, decided to go ahead and raise money and eventually construct this obelisk that you see in front of you right here. Now, you might ask, why did they choose an obelisk, and why are obelisks seen in cemeteries throughout the country? Well, first we have to go back, way back. In fact, we have to go further back than the Victorian era itself, all the way back to ancient Egypt. Sometime around the Middle to New Kingdom, what would eventually arise from the land of the Nile is a particular type of monument that would be used throughout the entire nation, especially by their kings, otherwise it would be later known as pharaohs. They would erect these tall obelisks, structures like the one you see in front of you, that would be inscribed with their name, their deeds, and whatever else they wish to proclaim upon them. Now, these objects were quite significant. They were far taller than this one that you see in front of you, and they were all carved out of a single solitary stone, sometimes upwards of 100 to 150 feet tall. So these were massive objects, and the reason why they constructed them was because they were prominent monuments. They were easily noticeable, easily seen from a distance, a considerable distance even, sometimes upwards of a mile or two away. The first thing you might end up seeing is just the tops of these obelisks. And it's no exception today, where if you go into an older cemetery, the first things you'll see are the tops of the obelisks, because these are a very tall, prominent monument. And usually the Egyptians, what they would do is they would inscribe their pharaoh, like which pharaoh did it and for what reason for the erection of this monument. And this would eventually lead to these monuments being just built all throughout the nation, both in the Upper Nile and in the Lower Nile. However, by the time of, say, the Romans, in the classical era, these monuments would slowly start falling out of favor, and eventually they would not be making any more of these sorts of monuments for quite well over a millennia or two. Though these objects were still seen and respected well into the medieval era, with some of them ending up in Rome, for example, taken there by the Romans, and then later on being erected, in Vatican City itself. However, you wouldn't see the return of the obelisk until much later on in the Victorian era. And the reason why stems from, quite simply, one fact. Egyptian culture in ancient Egypt suddenly became very popular in the Victorian era. It was starting around the 1820s when the Egyptian language would finally be decoded, for the lack of a better term. It would be essentially rediscovered, and we were able to gain a greater wealth of information from that. And as a result, there was just a general interest in learning about the language overall, as well as the British stumbling into Egypt during the Napoleonic Wars, eventually exposed the exotic nature of Egypt to Western audiences, particularly the English audience, who then became madly obsessed with it to the point where they'd often just buy things that were from Egypt. Like, for example, for the more wealthy people, they'd just buy entire Egyptian mummies and just unwrap them because it was something they wanted to look into, see what they could see in there. Some some men would buy entire sarcophaguses and then have them in their estate. But this also led to an architectural renaissance as well, where a new form of architecture would come from it, particularly that they're of Neo-Egyptian style, which here in the city of Richmond, Virginia, there's actually a couple buildings that are built upon the Egyptian style, most famously the Egyptian building, which is currently owned by VCU, and it was actually used as a medical school during the 1830s and 1840s. But this wouldn't be exclusive to building architecture. It would also extend here to the cemetery, where the most obvious and most significant symbol of the Egyptians, which is that being the obelisk, would eventually see its appearance in the early to mid-Victorian era, and quite early on, sometime in the 1810s, 1820s, and then growing in popularity throughout the years. So, as a result, people such as the Ladies Society here at Oakwood Cemetery would eventually fund the construction of an obelisk like the one you see before you, in order to act as a major monument for the men that are buried here. And as a result, many other people would eventually buy these obelisks or have someone craft them and then have them as their memorials. So I want to go ahead and show you a couple of different examples that explain some of the differences between them and give you an idea of somewhat of how these things were even constructed and why some of them are still standing today and why some end up falling over, end up being, destroyed over time. This obelisk here belongs to a E.F. Likes of the 2nd Florida Infantry Regiment, who's buried here at Oakwood Cemetery in Section B. Now, I've covered his obelisk at least once or twice before on the channel, but it's worth covering it again because of the topic of this video and the interesting nature it has to it. You can first see at the bottom, it has a granite base, which is sitting on top of what I believe is a marble base, which is more likely than not the original base. And then you have the obelisk itself, which has a sharp incline angle of somewhere between 85 to 89 degrees, and then it eventually shifts over towards the pyramidal top that you see just above it. Now, what makes this rather unique and why I'm covering it in this video is that the epitaph is written directly onto the obelisk itself. Many of the other examples we'll see won't have this, especially if the obelisk isn't tall enough. It will not have the epitaph written on the obelisk itself, or if it has a nice proper base to it, it will have the epitaph written on that base rather than on the obelisk itself. But there's also a reason why you usually don't write it on there, especially on a softer stone material like marble, and that is the epitaph, as you can see right here, can often suffer from erosion very easily and can become so worn out that it's hard to see. In this example, you can still make out the lettering fairly well, but it's fairly difficult to still distinguish because what eventually happens is that due to it being on the side of the obelisk itself, any water runs directly down the surface of it, and as a result, it leads to it basically being eroded away over time. And in the more extreme examples, especially those where people have tried to clean them up and they end up damaging it, you can basically just wipe out the entire epitaph on the side of it. And as a result, it'd be impossible to distinguish it. And there's at least one example that I've found here at Oakwood Cemetery, which I'll make sure I show here in the video. So we'll go ahead and see a few other examples from this one here and see how they all vary. This example here is another type of obelisk that you might see. It's still technically an obelisk in a sense, but unlike a lot of the others, it just has these straight four sides to it, and then the pyramidal top on top. This particular example belongs to a John C. Fitzgerald who was born January 19th, 1856, and then died May 26th, 1912. And as you can see just down there on the base, you can actually see he was a member of Woodmen of the World, which I've covered before here on the channel, particularly their famous and rather interesting looking headstones like that one just over there. This example here belongs to a Peter Martin who died on October 13th, 1862 and lived for a fairly decent age, being born in 1806. His example here is made entirely out of granite and has a far wider base compared to some of the other examples like the ones you see in the background just over there. And this has an interesting little benefit to it. That benefit being that it distributes the weight of the obelisk across a greater area, as well as making it more stable. So as a result, in cases such as, for example, high wind, like windy days, or for example a hurricane blows through, this obelisk is far less likely to fall over and suffer damage compared to some of the ones with a smaller base and generally a little bit taller. This also is similar to some of the older obelisks that you'll see in some of the older cemeteries, where they usually will have the wider base and usually won't be as tall. Though this example here is probably a later example of that same design and isn't one that is as popular as some of the other designs that we'll see later on. And just only a few steps away from the obelisk to Peter Martin, we actually have an example of one of these obelisks that has fallen over the years. This particular example just over here. And you can actually kind of see a little bit of the overall makeup of what these obelisks were designed as. For example, you can see here the stone is rough hewn, and as well you can see here these holes. Those holes exist because what they would do is they would have iron rods that would go down into these holes that would help support the overall obelisk itself and make it a little bit less prone to falling over. Now, this obelisk belongs to a James Elizabeth, the wife of W.R. Hughes, who was born in 1837, died in 1882. This monument here belongs to William H. Pitts and his wife Henrietta R. Pitts, with William H. Pitts being born in 1830 and then dying December 28th, 1910, and Henrietta R. Pitts being born in 1843 and then dying December 23rd, 1934. Now, their monument, which is another obelisk, is a little bit different from the others as well. You'll notice that it actually has an additional carving on the top, and that is actually meant to be a drape of some form. This is one of those traditional things that you will see quite a bit in older Victorian style cemeteries, because this symbolizes death, the veil of death falling upon, say, this family here, where this will usually be used and draped over things like, for example, on top of an obelisk like this one, or on top of an urn or something of that nature. And as a result, it adds a little bit more of an aesthetic to it that you would otherwise not have. And a lot of these obelisks will have some sort of aesthetic flair to it, which you'll probably have noticed at least by this point, though I'll show a few more examples of them later on. This example belongs to a Euphemia G. and J.R. Moncastle, who were both, like, one died in 1862, which I believe that would be Euphemia, and then I believe either her husband or consort, either one, died in 1884. And as you can see, there's carved in it a willow tree. This is one of those mid-Victorian era symbols that were often used on headstones in general, that represents life after death. It was a symbol of death because the willow tree is a weeping willow. And a weeping willow, of course, looks like it's weeping, shedding tears, making it fairly popular for monuments and memorials to those who had recently passed away. And this also is something that you'll sometimes see with these headstones, that these obelisks will sometimes have extra carvings into them like this one. The next few obelisks I'm going to cover in a rapid fire session, as they're all basically right next to one another. So, the first example we'll be covering with is George S. Miles' obelisk, which he was born in 1832, died in 1909, and he was a Confederate veteran, as you can see. And his obelisk is a fairly rough-hewn stone style obelisk, which is one of the styles that was used during the time. Now, I've covered his grave before, at least once before on the channel. And the reason why is because on the opposite side, it includes this, where on the opposite side here, you have the name of the captain of the company that he had served with in the war, as well as the men of Company B of the 19th Virginia Battalion, otherwise the 19th Virginia Infantry Regiment, which includes men such as R. Savage, J. Scott, C. M. Dunton, D. Dennis, and J. E. Holman, all of whom he served with during the war, and more likely than not died during the war at some point. Now, as we make our way around here, we're going to go to the second obelisk, which is very similar to George S. Miles' obelisk. It's another rough-hewn stone example. And we will look at who this one belongs to. It belongs to the Boisseaus, specifically a Milligant Anne, wife of Edmund Boisseau, and their only daughter, Wilhelmina and Eliza F. Bacon, who was born, they were born in Nottingham, England in 1825, and then died October 29th, 1898. More likely than not, that would be referring to the father of the family. Next, we're going to be covering this one, which is another one of these rough-hewn headstones, as you can see here. And this one belongs to the Schleyer family. This side here, you can see it belongs to Eliza A. Schleyer, who was born 1833 and died November 25th, 1882, by the looks of it, or 1888. And then you have her husband, George Schleyer, however you wish to pronounce it, because it's German, it can be kind of hard to pronounce, as you can tell, who also died sometime in the 1880s. It's a little bit hard to read due to the lighting conditions. Finally, you have the Scherer obelisk, which is just over here. This one belongs to a Gino M. Scherer and his wife, Eliza F. Scherer. The former was born in 1813 and then died in 1866, while the latter was born in, according to this here, 1803 and then died in 1886. This one is a little bit different from the other two, as it has a rounded top rather than the normal pyramidal top, and also has a little bit more of a crenellation towards the top of the monument itself, which makes it somewhat of a unique obelisk compared to a lot of the others that you'll see in most other cemeteries throughout the country. So, after the 19th century, what eventually happened was the obelisk would eventually just fall out of favor, just like with a lot of other traditions of the time. You would start seeing a lot of these different types of monuments eventually be phased out for more, I would say, generic examples, but also more economically viable examples, where the obelisk is very much an expensive monument and memorial in its own right. A lot of the other monuments, just like the ones you can see in the background, are a little bit easier to afford for people, as well as them being a little bit more subdued. And as a result, the obelisk has slowly fallen out of favor, out of its glory days of the 19th century. But then again, it already had suffered its first death, effectively. With the end of ancient Egypt, the obelisk had fallen out of favor for a long time. Yet that didn't mean that it wouldn't return in some way or form later on. And I think that is a very important thing to remember here. We all have our time. We shine like we have our time on the stage. And then eventually we have to leave and depart it. Though that does not mean we will never leave a legacy behind for others to follow and emulate. And in a way, we have emulated the ancient Egyptians by borrowing one of their most iconic images and one of their most iconic monument types and reusing it for our own meaningful way of saying that we still love and connect to the people that we once knew. So, I hope everyone has a blessed day, and may God bless all of you.